The knock came at midnight. 3 heavy strikes that shook the cabin door like thunder. Claire Monroe gripped her rifle, heart hammering, as a voice like gravel and wind called through the darkness. "They told me you're alone up here, woman. Let me give you sons." She'd fled Boston to escape ghosts, not to face mountain men with demands carved from another century. But when she threw open that door, rifle raised, the man standing there wasn't what she expected. He was worse. He was everything she'd sworn never to need again. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop a comment below and tell me where this story has reached you. Let's see how far into the world Claire's journey can travel. The October wind carried the smell of pine and coming snow as the Denver and Rio Grande train groaned to a stop at the Leadville depot. Claire Monroe stepped onto the platform with nothing but a carpet bag that had seen better decades and a letter that promised her a life she wasn't sure she wanted. Around her, miners and merchants bustled with the fevered energy of men chasing silver and salvation. She stood still as a stone in a river, letting them flow past. "Ma'am?" The station master, a wizened man with tobacco-stained whiskers, squinted at her. "You got someone meeting you?" "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "I'm going to the Monroe homestead, up in the high country." His expression shifted, concern mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "That's Margaret Monroe's old place? That cabin's been empty near 3 years now. Rough country for a woman alone." "I'm aware." Claire adjusted her grip on the carpet bag. "Can you direct me to someone who can take me up there?" The station master scratched his jaw, studying her with the frank assessment of a man who'd seen too many greenhorns arrive with dreams and leave in pine boxes. She knew what he saw: a woman in her late 20s, Boston tailored but wearing widow's weeds that had faded from black to charcoal gray, with eyes that had already seen too much to be easily frightened. "There's a freighter named Dutch Carlson who runs supplies up that way twice a month," he said finally, "but he won't go up again until next week. Weather's turning. Then I'll hire a horse and go myself. Ma'am, thank you for your help." She turned before he could launch into whatever well-meaning warnings he'd been preparing. She'd heard enough warnings in Boston. From her late husband's family, who'd called her foolish for leaving. From the bank manager who'd raised his eyebrows at a widow requesting to liquidate her modest inheritance. From the lawyer who'd handed her Aunt Margaret's letter and deed, asking 3 times if she truly understood what she was doing. She understood perfectly. She was choosing to survive on her own terms, in a place where the only ghosts were the ones she brought with her. The livery stable smelled of hay and horse sweat and honest work. The owner, a broad-shouldered man with a Swedish accent, was more practical than the station master. He sold her a steady mare named Greta, a saddle that had seen hard use but still had good years in it, and supplies for the 2-day ride into the mountains. "You know the trail?" he asked as she loaded her bags. "I have a map." "Map don't tell you where the creek crossings run high or where the rock slides come down." He handed her a rolled piece of canvas. "This here's got notes from Dutch Carlson himself. Follow it close. And ma'am?" He waited until she met his eyes. "If you see smoke from another cabin, don't assume it's friendly. Some men up there, they left civilization for reasons." Claire felt the weight of the rifle she'd purchased that morning, now strapped to her saddle. "I'll keep that in mind." She rode out of Leadville as the afternoon sun painted the peaks in shades of amber and gold. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of aspen that shimmered like coins in the breeze, their leaves already touched with autumn's fire. With each mile, the air grew thinner and colder, carrying the sharp scent of altitude and possibility. The first night she camped beside a stream that chattered over smooth stones, the sound almost like conversation. She built a small fire, made coffee in a battered tin pot, and ate salt pork with hardtack that tasted like civilization's last goodbye. Above her, stars emerged in numbers she'd never seen in Boston, thousands upon thousands of them, so bright they cast shadows. She thought about Thomas, her husband, who'd died at Antitrap Courthouse 3 months before the war ended. She thought about little Samuel, who'd followed his father into the ground less than a year later, taken by scarlet fever before his 5th birthday. She thought about the house in Boston that had become a mausoleum of memories, and the empty years that had stretched ahead of her like a sentence. "I'm done with empty," she said aloud to the stars. Her voice sounded strange in the wilderness, but also somehow right. I'm done with waiting for life to hurt me again. The stars offered no comment, which she appreciated. The second day brought her higher into country that seemed carved by gods, with a taste for drama. Peaks thrust up like cathedral spires, their tops already dusted with snow that gleamed in the thin sunlight. The trail narrowed, following the contours of ridges that dropped away into valleys so deep they held their own weather. Twice she saw elk, their antlers magnificent, watching her with the calm superiority of beings who belonged here in ways she did not. By late afternoon, the trail descended into a valley cupped between three mountains. A creek ran silver through its center, and scattered pines gave way to a clearing where a cabin stood like a promise half kept. Margaret Monroe's cabin. Her cabin now. Claire reined Greta to a stop and simply looked at what she'd inherited. The structure was small but solid. Logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney at one end, a covered porch that sagged slightly to the left. The roof appeared intact, though she could see places where the wooden shingles had curled with age. Windows on either side of the door stared out like eyes that had seen 3 winters of emptiness. Behind the cabin, the forest rose up the mountain slope in dark green ranks. To the east, the valley opened toward distant peaks already touched with sunset pink. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with truth. "Well," she said to Greta, "let's see what we've inherited." The cabin door wasn't locked. Out here, locks were apparently optional. Inside, dust lay thick over everything, and mouse droppings decorated the corners, but the structure was sound. An iron stove squatted in one corner, its pipe disappearing up through the roof. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat beneath one window. A narrow bed frame waited against the far wall, its rope supports sagging. Shelves lined the walls, still holding a few dust-covered jars and a tin cup. It was the smallest house Claire had ever lived in. It was also the first one that felt like it might become hers. She spent the last hours of daylight unloading her supplies and beginning the work of making the place habitable. She swept out the mouse droppings and dust, checked the stovepipe for obstructions, and tested the bed frame's ropes to see which ones needed replacing. When darkness finally forced her to stop, she built a fire in the stove, the first fire these walls had seen in 3 years, and made coffee and a simple meal of beans and bacon. Sitting at the table with her tin plate and cup, watching firelight flicker across the cabin's rough walls, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a tentative, fragile sense of peace. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to wind or creak or settling wood. Footsteps on the porch. She froze, fork halfway to her mouth, as the steps moved from one end of the porch to the other. Slow, measured, the footsteps of someone who wasn't trying to be quiet but also wasn't in any hurry. Claire set down her fork carefully and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall beside her chair. The Winchester felt heavy and solid in her hands as she rose, moving toward the door. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment there was only silence and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Then 3 heavy knocks shook the door, deliberate, demanding, impossible to ignore. "I know you're in there," a man's voice called through the wood, deep, rough-edged, with an accent that suggested mountains rather than cities. "Saw your smoke from the ridge." Claire's mouth went dry. She positioned herself to the side of the door, rifle raised, finger on the trigger. "State your business." A pause, then, "Just being neighborly, making sure you know you're not alone up here." "I came here specifically to be alone." "That's so." Something in his tone shifted, not quite amusement, but close. "Then you picked the wrong valley, widow woman. This whole basin's been my territory for 6 years now." The casual certainty of that statement, "my territory," sent a flash of anger through Claire's fear. "According to the deed I hold, this land belongs to the Monroe estate, which means it belongs to me." "Deed don't mean much at 10,000 feet, ma'am. Up here, what matters is who can survive the winter, who can hunt and trap and fix a roof when the snow gets so deep it'd bury a horse. I'll manage. Will you now?" The voice moved closer to the door. "They told me in Leadville that Margaret Monroe's niece had come up here. Said she was a Boston widow with more stubbornness than sense. That sound about right?" Claire's grip tightened on the rifle. "Who told you?" "Dutch Carlson, the freighter. He asked me to keep an eye on the cabin, make sure you didn't freeze to death or get eaten by a cat your first week up here." "I don't need a guardian." "Maybe not. But you need someone who knows this country, someone who can teach you how to survive it. A pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, something raw and honest beneath the rough edges. They told me you're alone up here, woman. Let me give you sons. The words hung in the cold air like smoke, impossible and audacious and utterly sincere. Claire's finger tightened on the trigger. You have 3 seconds to get off my porch before I put a bullet through this door. Can't do that, ma'am. 1. Your roof's got a weak spot over the northwest corner. See it from here. 2. And your chimney needs mud packing on the north side, or you'll lose heat something fierce when the real cold comes. 3. Claire threw open the door, rifle raised and ready. The man standing on her porch was nothing like she'd imagined. Tall, yes, well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders with the kind of lean strength that came from hard living rather than easy muscle. He wore buckskin pants and a wool coat that had seen years of weather, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a beard that softened a face made of hard angles and harder experience. But it was his eyes that stopped her, dark as the forest at midnight, holding depths she couldn't read. He looked at her rifle without flinching, then at her face with an expression that might have been respect. That's a good sight picture, he said calmly. You know how to use that Winchester? I know which end the bullets come out of. That's a start. He made no move to come closer, just stood there in the porch shadows with his hands visible and empty. Name's Elias Cross. I trapped these mountains, been doing it since '81. Your Aunt Margaret and I had an understanding. I kept watch on her cabin when she was down in Leadville for the winters, and she let me use her spring for water when the creek ran low. Claire kept the rifle level. My aunt never mentioned you. Probably because I asked her not to. I came up here to get away from people mentioning me. His gaze drifted past her to the warm glow of the cabin interior. But I made Dutch Carlson a promise that I'd make sure you knew the truth of this place. So here it is, plain. Winter up here can kill you 6 different ways before breakfast. You'll need to lay in 3 cords of wood minimum, get your roof properly sealed, and learn which snow means a storm's passing and which means it's just getting started. And in exchange for this wisdom, you expect what? A wife? The words came out sharp with sarcasm. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or memory. I expect nothing, ma'am. I'm telling you what you need to know because Margaret was decent to me, and because I don't particularly want to dig a grave come spring. Claire lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't set it aside. That speech about giving me sons was me being direct. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I've been up here alone too long, forgotten how to talk to civilized folk. What I meant was, he stopped, seemed to search for words. There's strength in numbers up here. Margaret understood that. She survived as long as she did because she wasn't too proud to accept help when it was offered freely. And when it wasn't offered freely, his eyes met hers again, and she saw something cold and hard beneath the surface. Then she knew how to use that rifle she kept by the door. Same one you're holding now, I'd wager. Claire glanced down at the Winchester in her hands, seeing it with new understanding. Her aunt's rifle, a weapon worn smooth with use and care. Margaret and I were friends, Elias continued quietly. Nothing more. She had her cabin, I had mine up on the ridge. But we looked out for each other. That's how you survive up here, not by being alone, but by knowing who you can trust when the wolves come down or the snow gets deep enough to trap you inside for weeks. And you think I should trust you? A man who appears out of the darkness making proclamations about sons? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. No, ma'am. I think you should trust your rifle and your own judgment, but I also think you should know that when that roof starts groaning under the weight of snow, and it will, you're going to need help you can't provide yourself. He took a step back toward the porch stairs. I'll leave you be tonight, but come morning, I'll be back to show you what needs doing before the first real snow hits. You can point that rifle at me again if it makes you feel better, but I'm coming anyway. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why do you care? Elias paused at the top of the steps, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of things long buried. Because I know what it's like to be alone up here, and I know what it costs. He glanced back over his shoulder. Margaret used to say that the mountains don't care about your reasons for coming. They only care about whether you're strong enough to stay. I think you might be, widow woman, but strength alone won't get you through your first winter. He descended the steps and vanished into the darkness beyond the fire's light, moving with the quiet certainty of a man who belonged to the wilderness. Claire stood on the porch long after he'd gone, rifle in her hands, staring at the place where he'd disappeared. The night around her was alive with sounds, wind in the pines, the creek's eternal song, the distant call of something hunting in the darkness. She thought about his words, about sons and survival and the cost of being alone. She thought about the audacity of a man who'd knock on a stranger's door at night and speak of futures as if they were his to offer. She thought about the look in his eyes, not predatory, not precisely, but hungry in a way that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. Finally, as the cold began to bite through her dress, she went back inside and barred the door. But she also found herself checking the northwest corner of the cabin, where the roof met the wall. Sure enough, in the dim light of her oil lamp, she could see a gap in the chinking, a weakness in the structure that would let precious heat escape when winter truly arrived. He'd been right about that, at least. Claire sat at her table, the rifle across her lap, and finished her cold dinner. The coffee had gone bitter, but she drank it anyway, using the familiar ritual to steady herself. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. If this Elias Cross returned as promised, she'd deal with him in the daylight, when she could see him clearly, and when his words didn't carry the strange weight that darkness and isolation gave them. But tonight, as she finally climbed into bed, her aunt's bed, in her aunt's cabin, in this valley that was somehow both hers and not hers, she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. The mountains don't care about your reasons for coming. They only care about whether you're strong enough to stay. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shingles on the roof and whistling through gaps she'd need to find and seal. The cabin creaked and settled around her like a living thing testing her presence, deciding whether to accept her or reject her. Claire pulled the quilts up to her chin and stared at the ceiling beams, barely visible in the darkness. "I'm strong enough," she whispered to the empty room, to the mountains beyond, to whatever judgment waited in the coming winter. "I have to be." But even as she said it, she wondered if strength was truly enough, or if Elias Cross had been right about that too. That survival in this place required more than determination. That it required the kind of desperate cooperation between souls who had nothing left to lose but each other. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she finally drifted toward sleep, she found it strangely comforting. She was not the only ghost haunting these mountains, and perhaps, just perhaps, ghosts could learn to help each other find their way back to something resembling life. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the distant, mournful call of a wolf somewhere high on the ridges, a sound both warning and welcome, both threat and promise. "This is the place where you'll learn what you're made of," the wolf seemed to say. "This is where your new life begins, if you're brave enough to claim it." Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the valley in shades of silver and gold. Claire woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. Steady, rhythmic strikes that echoed off the surrounding peaks like a heartbeat. She sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment before memory flooded back. The cabin, the mountains, the man who'd appeared in the darkness with his impossible proclamations. She threw back the quilts and moved to the window, pulling aside the flour sack curtain her aunt had hung years ago. Through the warped glass, she could see him, Elias Cross, working in the clearing behind her cabin as if he had every right to be there. He'd already felled a large dead pine and was now systematically reducing it to stove-length pieces, his movements efficient and practiced in the morning light. Claire dressed quickly, anger rising hot in her chest. She'd told him she didn't need help, hadn't she? She'd made it clear that she'd come here to be alone. Yet here he was, taking liberties with her land and her mourning as if her words meant nothing at all. She grabbed the rifle and stormed outside, boots crunching on frost-stiff grass. "I don't recall giving you permission to cut wood on my property," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut the morning air. Elias buried the axe in the stump he'd been using as a chopping block and turned to face her. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, the weathered lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark beard, the way his buckskin shirt stretched across shoulders built for hard work. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, though the mountains might have aged him beyond his years. "Morning, Mrs. Monroe," he said, as casually as if they were neighbors meeting on a Boston street. Coffee's hot if you want some. Only then did Claire notice the small fire he'd built at a safe distance from the cabin, with a battered tin pot suspended over the flames. I have my own coffee. Suit yourself. He moved to the fire and poured himself a cup, the steam rising in pale wisps. But you might want to save your stores. That pine I'm cutting? It's been dead 3 years, dried out perfect. Burns hot and long. You'll need every bit of seasoned wood you can get. Claire lowered the rifle slightly, watching him with narrowed eyes. You said you'd come back this morning to show me what needed doing. You didn't say you'd start doing it without asking. Asking wastes time. Weather's turning. Can you feel it? He gestured toward the western peaks with his cup. See how those clouds are building? That's not rain coming, that's snow. First real storm of the season, probably hit tomorrow or the day after. Your roof won't hold under heavy snow load, not with that weak spot and those curled shingles. So we need to fix it today. We? Elias took a long drink of coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. You can do it yourself if you prefer. I'll tell you what needs doing and where to find the materials, but it'll take you 3 days to finish what I can help you do in 1. Your choice, ma'am. Pride or practicality? The words stung because they were true. Claire had never repaired a roof in her life. She could probably figure it out, given time, but time was apparently something the mountains weren't willing to give her. Why are you really doing this? She asked, setting the rifle against a tree stump but keeping it within reach. And don't tell me it's because you made Dutch Carlson a promise. There's something else. For a long moment, Elias just looked at her, and Claire had the unsettling sense that he was deciding how much truth to offer. Finally, he set down his cup and spoke. 6 years ago, I came up here with my wife and daughter. Adeline was 31. Emma was 7. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes went distant. We were going to build a life away from civilization, away from the war and the noise and the people. We had plans, dreams. He paused. The first winter, I was out running trap lines when a storm came up fast. Adeline tried to keep the fire going, but the wood was green. I hadn't laid in enough seasoned fuel. Smoke filled the cabin. They both... He stopped, jaw working. They both died while I was a mile away, checking traps that didn't matter. Claire felt the words land in her chest like stones. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be smart. He picked up his axe. I won't watch another woman die in these mountains because she was too stubborn to accept help. Call it penance if you want. Call it whatever lets you keep your pride. But I'm fixing that roof today, with or without your permission. He turned back to his work, the axe rising and falling with renewed intensity, and Claire understood that the conversation was over. She stood there for a long moment, watching him work, processing what he'd revealed. He'd lost everything, just as she had. He'd come to the mountains seeking the same escape, the same impossible peace, and instead of finding it, he'd found only more grief. All right, she said finally. Tell me what to do. Elias paused mid-swing, glancing back at her with something that might have been surprise. You willing to go up on the roof? If that's what needs doing, then you'll need better boots than those. He nodded at her worn leather boots, fine for Boston streets, but inadequate for mountain work. Margaret kept a pair of work boots in the cabin, under the bed. Should fit you well enough. And find her work gloves. They'll be in the trunk by the stove. Claire returned to the cabin, oddly comforted by the fact that her aunt had left these things behind, as if Margaret had known someone would need them someday. The boots were scuffed and broken in, molding to Claire's feet like a second skin. The gloves were heavy canvas, stained with years of use, but still sturdy. When she emerged, Elias had finished cutting the wood and was stacking it in neat rows against the cabin's north wall. He'd also laid out an assortment of tools, hammers, nails, a bucket of what looked like tar, and strips of birch bark. First lesson, he said, straightening up. Mountain building is about keeping water out and heat in. Everything else is secondary. That weak spot in your roof? Water's been getting in there, rotting the wood underneath. We need to replace the damaged sections, seal everything tight, then layer on extra protection before the snow comes. For the next hour, Claire learned more about roof construction than she'd ever imagined needing to know. Elias moved around the cabin like a man conducting an inspection, pointing out every weakness, every potential failure point. He explained how snow would accumulate, where the weight would be greatest, which sections could tolerate stress, and which would collapse without reinforcement. "You listening?" he asked at one point, catching her staring at him rather than the roofline he was describing. "Yes. The northeast corner needs an extra support beam because the snow load drifts there." "And?" "And the chimney flashing is loose, which means water can seep down into the walls and freeze, causing cracks." "Good." He handed her a hammer. "Let's get to work." They climbed onto the roof using a ladder Elias had apparently stored in Margaret's shed. Another thing he'd known about that Claire hadn't. Up there, with the valley spread out below them and the mountains rising on all sides like ancient sentinels, Claire felt simultaneously exposed and exhilarated. The wind was stronger at this height, carrying the scent of pine and stone and distance. Elias worked with quiet efficiency, showing her how to remove damaged shingles without disturbing sound ones, how to cut and fit new pieces, how to seal everything with tar and strips of bark. His hands, she noticed, bore the scars of hard living, burn marks from fire, straight lines from blade cuts, the general weathering of skin that had known too much cold and too little gentleness. "You're doing fine," he said at one point, watching her hammer a nail with careful precision. "Better than most. Margaret would be proud." "Did you teach her too?" "Some. But Margaret came up here already knowing how to work with her hands. Her husband was a builder before he died. She just needed to learn the mountain way of doing things, how to adapt for altitude and weather." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the tap of hammers and the whisper of wind through the pines. Claire found herself falling into a rhythm, her initial anger at Elias's presumption fading into something more complex. There was an intimacy to working alongside someone like this, their movements coordinating without words, their shared goal creating a temporary bridge across the gulf of their separate griefs. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead despite the cold air. "Depends on the question. Last night, when you said that thing about giving me sons, did you actually mean it?" Elias stopped working and sat back on his heels, looking at her directly. "I meant that these mountains are hard on people alone, that survival sometimes requires partnerships we wouldn't choose in easier places, that there's a kind of sense to it, two people who've already lost everything, building something new together." He paused. "But I didn't mean to frighten you or insult you. If I did, I apologize." You didn't frighten me," Claire said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "You just caught me off guard. I came here expecting solitude, not proposals." "It wasn't a proposal, more like a statement of possibility." He turned back to his work. "I've been alone up here 6 years, Mrs. Monroe, long enough to know that survival isn't the same as living, long enough to wonder if maybe I was wrong to choose isolation over everything else. And now? Now I'm fixing a roof." His tone suggested the conversation was over, and Claire let it drop. By midday, they'd replaced all the damaged sections and were sealing the repairs with tar. The work was messy and smelled strongly of pine pitch, but Claire could see the difference already. The roof looked solid, competent, ready to bear whatever weight winter wanted to throw at it. "Come down," Elias said, starting toward the ladder. "I'll make us something to eat." But before Claire could follow, her foot slipped on a patch of tar. She felt herself sliding toward the roof's edge, her heart lurching into her throat as her hands scrabbled for purchase on the smooth shingles. For one terrible moment she thought she'd fall, thought she'd survive Boston and the train journey, and her first night in the mountains only to break her neck on her own property in broad daylight. Then Elias's hand clamped around her wrist, strong as iron. "I've got you," he said calmly, bracing himself against the roof's angle. "Plant your feet. Find your balance." Claire did as he instructed, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Slowly, carefully, Elias pulled her away from the edge and back to the solid center of the roof. His hand remained on her wrist even after she'd found safe footing, warm through the canvas of her glove. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shakier than she would have liked. "First rule of mountain work. Don't die doing something stupid." But his eyes held concern rather than criticism. "You all right?" "Yes, just embarrassed." "Don't be. Everyone slips their first time on a pitched roof covered in tar." He released her wrist. "But maybe I should go down first, make sure the ladder's steady." They descended without further incident, and Claire found her legs were trembling slightly from the surge of adrenaline. Elias noticed, of course. The man seemed to notice everything, but had the grace not to comment. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a log he'd positioned near the fire. "I'll make food." Claire watched as he worked, pulling supplies from a pack she hadn't noticed before. Salt pork, dried beans, an onion that looked slightly withered but still good. He added them to a pot with water from the creek, along with what looked like wild herbs he produced from a leather pouch at his belt. "You always carry cooking supplies?" she asked. "I always carry everything I might need to survive a few days away from my cabin. Rule of the mountains, assume you won't make it home." "That's a grim way to live." "That's the way to stay alive." He stirred the pot. "Your aunt used to say I was too cautious, but cautious beats dead." As the stew cooked, filling the air with savory smells that made Claire's stomach growl, Elias taught her other things. How to read the clouds for weather, how to identify the call of different predators, how to find water even when the creeks froze solid. He spoke with the authority of hard-earned experience, and Claire found herself listening with an attention she rarely gave to anything. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked again, unable to let the question go. "And don't tell me it's just because of what happened to your family. There's something else. I can feel it." Elias poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the afternoon sky. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said finally. "Maybe I've spent 6 years punishing myself, and I'm starting to wonder if there might be something else worth trying. Or maybe I just recognize something in you, someone who came here not running from death, but looking for a reason to keep living." He glanced at her. "Am I wrong?" Claire felt her throat tighten. "No, you're not wrong." "Then maybe we can help each other. No promises, no obligations, just mutual survival." "That's all you want? Mutual survival?" His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw hunger and loneliness and a desperate hope he was trying hard to suppress. "I want what I said last night. A life that means something, children to teach and protect, a partner who's strong enough to face this country and not break. But I'm also not fool enough to think I can demand those things from a woman I met 12 hours ago." He stirred the stew. "So for now, I'll settle for making sure you don't die your first month up here. After that, we'll see." The honesty of it disarmed her. Claire was accustomed to Boston men who spoke in careful circumlocutions, who hid their true desires behind layers of social nicety. Elias had no such filters. He wanted what he wanted, stated it plainly, and then had the wisdom to wait. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, "and your help. But I need you to understand something. I didn't come here looking for a husband. I came here looking for myself." "Fair enough, but the two aren't mutually exclusive." He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and handed her one. "Eat. You'll need your strength for this afternoon." "There's more work?" "There's always more work. After we eat, I'll show you how to properly seal the chimney flashing. Then we need to check your stovepipe and make sure you've got adequate draw." "Then, how long do you plan to stay?" Claire interrupted, suddenly aware that the sun was already past its zenith. "Until the work's done. If that storm comes tomorrow, like I think it will, you need to be ready. Completely ready, not Boston widow ready." The jab stung, but Claire supposed she'd earned it. "Fine, but I'm doing the work myself. You can supervise." "Deal." Elias's rare smile appeared, transforming his hard face into something almost gentle. "You might survive up here after all, Mrs. Monroe. Please, call me Claire. If we're going to be, cooperating, we might as well use first names. Elias, then. Though most folks up here just call me Cross." They ate in silence, and the stew was better than anything Claire had tasted in months, rich with meat and herbs, warming her from the inside out. When they finished, Elias was true to his word, standing back and instructing while Claire did the actual work of sealing the chimney flashing. It was frustrating, detailed work that required her to perch on the roof's peak while carefully applying tar to every gap and seam. "More on the north side," Elias called up. "That's where the wind will drive the rain." "There's already a pound of tar up here." "Put another pound. You'll thank me when you're warm and dry instead of cold and wet." By late afternoon, the chimney was sealed, the stovepipe checked and cleaned, and the cabin's exterior examined for any other potential weaknesses. Elias had also shown her where to find clay near the creek for chinking gaps in the log walls, and how to identify which trees were dead and dry enough to cut for firewood. "You'll need 3 full cords before the snow flies," he said, surveying the modest stack already against the cabin. "Maybe 4 to be safe. That's a lot of cutting and splitting." "I'll manage." "I know you will, but you don't have to manage alone." He gathered his tools, preparing to leave. "I'll come back in 2 days, assuming the storm doesn't trap us both. We'll work on laying in wood." "Elias," Claire stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. So did goodbye. He seemed to understand her hesitation. "It's all right. You don't have to say anything. Just think about what I said. About partnership, about building something new instead of just surviving." He shouldered his pack. "My cabin's up on the North Ridge, about 3 miles from here. If you need me, if something happens, fire 3 shots from that Winchester. I'll hear it and come running." 3 shots. Any other number might just be hunting. 3 means trouble. He started toward the tree line, then paused and looked back. "You did good work today, Claire. Margaret would be proud. And so would your husband." The mention of Thomas caught her off guard, bringing sudden tears to her eyes. "How did you—" "Your wedding ring. You still wear it." Elias's voice was gentle. "I understand. I kept Adeline's things for 3 years before I could bear to let them go. Grief doesn't have a schedule." Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest as silently as he'd appeared the night before, leaving Claire alone with the lengthening shadows and her tangled thoughts. She spent the evening organizing her supplies and taking stock of what she had versus what she'd need. The list of the latter was depressingly long. She had flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and dried goods, but Elias was right about the wood. Her current supply wouldn't last a month, let alone a winter. She also needed to learn to hunt and trap, to preserve meat, to do 100 things she'd never needed to know in Boston. As darkness fell, Claire lit her lamp and sat at the table, writing in the journal she'd brought from home. She tried to capture the day, the roof work, the near fall, the strange intimacy of working alongside a man who understood loss the way she did. But words felt inadequate to describe the complexity of what she was feeling. Elias Cross was dangerous, she decided. Not in the way of violence or cruelty, but in the way of possibility. He represented a future she hadn't considered, a life she hadn't imagined. And the most dangerous part was how much sense he made, how his practical mountain logic cut through all her carefully constructed reasons for isolation. She thought about what he'd said, about survival versus living. For 3 years since Thomas's death, she'd been surviving, going through motions, fulfilling obligations, existing, but not truly alive. Was that what she wanted? To survive in a mountain cabin the same way she'd survived in a Boston house, just with different walls around her emptiness? The knock, when it came, nearly made her drop her pen, grabbed the rifle and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" "It's me." Elias's voice, but strained somehow. "I need help." She threw open the door to find him leaning against the frame, his face pale in the lamplight, his left hand pressed against his right shoulder where blood was seeping through his fingers. "What happened?" "Mountain lion," he said through gritted teeth. "Territorial male, didn't appreciate me walking through his hunting ground. I shot him, but not before he got his claws in me. Can I—" He swayed slightly. Claire caught him before he could fall, staggering under his weight as she helped him inside. She guided him to a chair, her mind racing through what little she knew about treating injuries. "Take off your coat," she ordered, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Let me see how bad it is." Elias complied, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. His shirt underneath was soaked with blood, and when Claire carefully cut away the fabric, she found 3 deep gashes running from his shoulder to his chest, claw marks that were still bleeding freely. "I need clean cloth," she said, "and whiskey if you have any, and needle and thread." "Pack," Elias managed, nodding toward the one he'd dropped by the door. "Medical supplies." Claire found what she needed: bandages, a bottle of whiskey, a curved needle, and gut thread that made her stomach turn. She'd never sewn human flesh before, but she'd watched the army surgeons work during the war when she'd volunteered at the hospital. Her hands remembered what her mind tried to forget. "This is gonna hurt," she warned. Everything hurts already. Just do it. He took a long pull from the whiskey bottle, then handed it to her. Clean the wounds first. Claire poured whiskey over the claw marks, and Elias made a sound between a grunt and a curse, his knuckles white where he gripped the chair arms. The wounds fizzed and bubbled, blood and alcohol mixing in a way that made Claire's stomach revolt. But she kept working, methodically cleaning each gash before threading the needle with trembling fingers. Tell me about Boston, Elias said suddenly, his voice tight with pain. Tell me anything. Just talk. So Claire talked. She told him about the house on Beacon Hill, about the way the harbor smelled at dawn, about Thomas's laugh and Samuel's obsession with toy soldiers. She talked about the war, about waiting for letters that came less and less frequently, about the day a telegraph arrived with the news that changed everything. She talked about grief and emptiness and the slow realization that her life had become a prison of memory. And while she talked, her hands worked. She stitched the 3 gashes closed with careful precision, her fingers slippery with blood but steady. Elias never cried out, never flinched beyond the initial tightening of his jaw. He just listened to her stories and breathed through the pain, occasionally taking another drink when the needle bit particularly deep. When she finished, the wounds were closed and the bleeding had slowed to a seep. Claire bandaged his shoulder with strips of clean cloth, wrapping them tightly enough to hold everything in place, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Done, she said, sitting back on her heels. Her hands were shaking now, covered in his blood, and she felt suddenly dizzy. You did good, Elias said softly. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clearer. Real good. Thank you. You should stay here tonight. That wound needs watching. Can't. Need to get back to my cabin, check my trap lines before the storm. The hell you will. Claire's voice came out sharp with fear and exhaustion. You're barely standing, you've lost blood, and there's a storm coming. You'll stay here. Sleep on my floor if you're too proud for the bed. But you're not walking 3 miles through the dark with fresh wounds. Elias looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. I'll stay. Claire helped him to the bed, her bed, Margaret's bed, and insisted he lie down properly despite his protests. She brought him water, more whiskey, and the rest of the stew from earlier, watching to make sure he ate and drank. Then she built up the fire in the stove, checked his bandages one more time, and made herself a rough pallet on the floor near the warmth. Claire, Elias's voice came soft through the darkness. Yes? When I said you might survive up here, I was wrong. You're not going to just survive. You're going to thrive. You've got the heart for it. She felt tears sting her eyes. Go to sleep, Elias. You need rest. One more thing. What? I lied earlier, when I said I'd settle for mutual survival. Truth is, the moment I saw you standing on that porch with your rifle, looking like you'd shoot me or kiss me, depending on how the conversation went, I knew I wanted more than survival with you. I knew I wanted everything. Claire's breath caught. You're delirious from blood loss. Maybe. Doesn't make it less true. A pause, then, think about it. That's all I'm asking. Just think about whether maybe we could be each other's everything instead of each other's nothing. She listened to his breathing slow and deepen as exhaustion and pain dragged him toward sleep. Outside, the wind was rising, and Claire thought she could smell snow on the air, that particular cold, clean scent that promised winter's arrival. She lay awake long after Elias had fallen asleep, watching firelight flicker across the cabin ceiling and thinking about impossible things. About a man who'd lost everything building something new with a woman who'd done the same. About partnership and possibility, and the strange courage it took to believe in a future when the past had taken so much. The mountains didn't care about her reasons for coming, Elias had said. They only cared whether she was strong enough to stay. But maybe, she thought, maybe strength wasn't just about enduring alone. Maybe it was also about having the courage to let someone help carry the weight. She fell asleep thinking about his words, about giving and receiving, about the peculiar mathematics of 2 broken souls trying to add up to something whole. Morning arrived with the hush that comes before storms, the air so still it felt like the mountains were holding their breath. Claire woke to find Elias already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his shirt off, examining his bandaged shoulder in the pale dawn light filtering through the window. "You should still be resting," she said, pushing herself up from her pallet on the floor. Every muscle in her body ached from the previous day's roof work and the tension of stitching a man's flesh by lamplight. "Can't rest. Storm's coming sooner than I thought." He gestured toward the window with his good arm. "See those clouds? We've got maybe 6 hours before it hits, and I need to get back to my cabin before then." Claire moved to the window and saw what he meant. The western sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and gray, and somehow alive with threat. The wind that had been so still moments ago was beginning to stir, making the pines sway and dance. "Your wounds will heal or they won't, but I've got traps that need checking and a cabin that needs securing. Animals don't care if I'm hurt." He stood carefully, testing his range of motion. His face went pale with the effort, but he didn't make a sound. "At least let me check the stitches before you go." Elias nodded, sitting back down, and Claire unwrapped the bandages with gentle fingers. In the morning light, the claw marks looked angry and swollen, the stitches holding but the flesh around them inflamed. She cleaned the wounds again with whiskey, applied a poultice of herbs Elias had in his pack, and rewrapped everything with fresh bandages. "You need to keep this clean," she said, tying off the last strip of cloth. "And if you see red streaks spreading from the wounds, that means infection. You'll need to—" "I know what infection looks like." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than dismissive. "Dealt with worse up here. But thank you. For last night. For everything." Their eyes met, and Claire felt again that strange pull, that sense of recognition between two people who'd both stared into the abyss and somehow found the strength to step back. She wanted to ask him to stay, to let her take care of him properly, but she also understood that would be asking him to be someone other than who he was. Elias Cross was a man who took care of himself, who'd survived 6 years alone in country that killed the weak and the unlucky. He wouldn't change that for her or anyone. "When the storm passes," he said, pulling on his ruined shirt and then his coat, "I'll come back, help you finish preparing. But Claire?" He paused at the door, his dark eyes intense. "I meant what I said last night, about wanting everything. I know I've got no right to ask, no claim on you, but I'm asking anyway. Think about it." "I will," she said, and realized it was true. She would think about it. She couldn't seem to stop thinking about it. He left then, disappearing into the restless forest, and Claire stood on the porch watching until she couldn't see him anymore. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow and distance, and she felt suddenly, achingly alone. But she didn't have time to indulge in loneliness. If a storm was coming, she needed to prepare. Claire spent the morning following Elias's instructions from the day before, bringing in every stick of firewood she had and stacking it inside where it would stay dry. She filled every container she owned with water from the creek. She checked and rechecked her supplies, making lists of what she had and what she lacked. She brought Greta into the shed behind the cabin, giving the mare extra feed and fresh water, talking to her in soothing tones that were as much for Claire's benefit as the horses. By noon, the first snowflakes were falling, fat, lazy flakes that drifted down like feathers. Within an hour, they'd multiplied into a wall of white that erased the forest, the peaks, everything beyond a few feet of the cabin. The wind rose to a howl that made the cabin walls groan and the windows rattle in their frames. Claire built up the fire in the stove and settled in to wait, watching the storm rage outside with a mixture of awe and fear. She'd seen snowstorms in Boston, but this was something else entirely, primal, powerful, indifferent to human presence or need. The world outside her windows had become a whiteout, and she understood for the first time the full weight of what Elias had been trying to teach her. Up here, nature wasn't a backdrop or an inconvenience. It was the dominant force, and humans survived only by respecting its power. She thought about Elias making his way back to his cabin through this, wounded and alone, and felt her stomach clench with worry. 3 miles might as well have been 30 in weather like this. But he was experienced, she told herself. He knew these mountains. He would make it, unless he didn't. The thought lodged in her mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. What if he collapsed from blood loss? What if the storm disoriented him? What if the mountain lion had infected his wounds with some bacteria that was even now spreading through his system? She'd told him to watch for red streaks, but who would watch for him? Claire paced the small cabin, rifle in hand, though she wasn't sure what threat she was guarding against. The storm? Her own thoughts? The realization that in less than 2 days, Elias Cross had become someone who mattered, someone whose absence created a hollow space in her carefully constructed solitude? She made coffee, drank it, made more, checked on Greta 3 times, fighting through drifts that were already knee-deep, fed the fire, stared out the window at nothing but white, and worried. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that screamed like something alive and angry. 3 days of snow that fell so thick and fast it seemed impossible the sky could hold so much. 3 days of watching her carefully stacked firewood dwindle and wondering if she'd prepared enough, if she'd done everything right, if she would see spring or become another cautionary tale about city women who didn't respect the mountains. On the third night, as the wind finally began to ease, Claire lay in bed listening to the silence that felt louder than any storm. Her thoughts kept returning to Elias, circling back to his words with obsessive regularity. He wanted everything. He wanted sons. He wanted a partner who could face this country and not break. Did she want those things too? Claire wasn't sure anymore. She'd come here to escape the ghost of her old life, not to build a new one. But maybe that had been short-sighted. Maybe choosing isolation was just another form of death, slower and colder, but still death nonetheless. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the son they'd created. That part of her life was over, buried in Massachusetts soil and memory. Nothing would bring it back. But did that mean she had to bury herself alongside those losses? Or could she honor what had been while still reaching toward what might be? The questions kept her awake until exhaustion finally dragged her under, and she dreamed of mountain lions and snowstorms, and a man with dark eyes who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. When she woke on the fourth morning, the storm had passed. The world outside her window was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, transformed into something both beautiful and alien. Every tree branch bore its burden of white. Every stone and stump had been sculpted into smooth, surreal shapes. The sky above was painfully blue, and the sun on snow was so bright it hurt to look at directly. Claire bundled herself in every warm thing she owned and ventured outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. The snow was deeper than she'd imagined, and breaking a path to the shed to check on Greta required effort that left her gasping. The mare was fine, better than fine actually, seeming to appreciate the company and the extra feed. Claire spent time brushing her, talking to her, grateful for a living presence that demanded nothing more complicated than care. When she returned to the cabin, she found fresh tracks in the snow leading up to her porch. Not human tracks, too large, and the wrong shape. Bear, maybe, though it seemed early in the winter for bears to be out. Or wolf. Elias had warned her about wolves, about how they'd come down from the high country when food got scarce, bold enough to approach cabins if they were hungry enough. Claire loaded the Winchester and kept it close as she went about her day, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. But nothing appeared except a few ravens, their black forms stark against the white landscape, calling to each other in voices that sounded like rusty hinges. By afternoon, she'd begun to really worry about Elias. 5 days now since she'd last seen him. 5 days in which anything could have happened. She considered trying to make her way to his cabin, but even if she could manage the 3-mile trek through waist-deep snow, she had no clear idea of where exactly on the North Ridge he lived. She might wander for days and never find it. So instead she did the only thing she could. She fired 3 shots from the Winchester, spacing them carefully, the sound echoing off the peaks like thunder. Then she waited. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began its early winter descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Claire fed the fire, made dinner she had no appetite for, and tried not to imagine Elias's body buried under snow, frozen and alone. The knock came just as full darkness settled over the valley. Claire grabbed the rifle and ran to the door, throwing it open to find Elias standing there, looking like some ghost of winter itself. Snow covered his coat and beard. His face was wind-burned and exhausted, and he was favoring his injured shoulder badly. But he was alive. He was here. "You fired 3 shots," he said, his voice rough. "I came. I was worried. The storm, your wounds." Claire stepped back. Come inside before you freeze. He limped into the cabin, bringing cold air and snow with him. In the lamplight, she could see how much the last 5 days had cost him. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed with pain and exhaustion. When he tried to remove his coat, he gasped, unable to lift his right arm high enough. "Let me help." Claire moved to him, carefully easing the frozen coat off his shoulders. Underneath, his shirt was stiff with old blood, and the bandages she could see at his neck were dirty and loose. "I need to see the wounds." "It's not pretty," he warned. "I didn't expect pretty. Sit down." She cut away his shirt for the second time in less than a week, revealing bandages that should have been changed days ago. When she unwrapped them, her breath caught. The wounds were infected, not terribly, but enough. Red streaks radiated from the claw marks, and the flesh was hot and swollen under her fingers. "You should have come back sooner," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "Couldn't. Storm trapped me at my cabin, same as you here. By the time it cleared enough to travel, I figured I might as well tough it out." He winced as she cleaned the wounds. "Besides, I didn't want to impose." "Impose? You're infected. This could kill you." "I've had worse." "That's not comforting." Claire worked quickly, cleaning the wounds thoroughly despite his sharp intakes of breath. The infection wasn't advanced enough to require cutting away dead tissue, thank God, but it was close. She applied fresh poultice, this time adding some of her own supplies, honey for its antiseptic properties, and crushed garlic she'd thought to bring from Boston. "Where'd you learn this?" Elias asked through gritted teeth. "The war. I volunteered at a field hospital after Thomas enlisted. Saw more infected wounds than I care to remember." She wrapped fresh bandages around his shoulder and chest. "You need rest and warmth and proper food. When did you last eat?" "Yesterday, maybe the day before, lost track." Claire wanted to scold him, to rage at his stubborn self-sufficiency that had nearly gotten him killed. But instead she guided him to the bed and made him lie down, then set about heating up stew and making strong coffee. She watched him eat, noting how his hand shook slightly, how he struggled to keep his eyes open. "Why did you really come?" she asked quietly. "When you heard my signal?" Elias set down his empty bowl and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you fired 3 shots. Because that means you needed help. And because—" He paused, seemed to gather himself. "Because somewhere in the last week you became the most important thing in my world. More important than trap lines or pride or the 6 years I've spent trying to forget I'm still alive." The words hung between them, raw and true and terrifying in their honesty. "Elias, I know. You came here to be alone. You're not looking for this. But I need you to understand something, Claire. When I walked 3 miles through snow with infection burning through my shoulder, when I pushed myself past reasonable limits because you might need help, that wasn't about obligation or neighborly duty. That was about the fact that I can't stand the thought of something happening to you. That in 1 week, you've become more precious to me than 6 years of solitude." Claire felt tears sting her eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you stitch wounds without flinching. I know you work a roof in the cold without complaining. I know you came to these mountains not to hide, but to find something worth living for." He reached out with his good hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just asking you to let me stay. Let me heal here. Let us figure out what this is between us." She should say no. She should remind him that she'd been widowed less than 3 years, that she'd come here specifically to avoid this kind of complication. She should protect herself, her heart, her carefully maintained distance from anything that might hurt her again. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "You can stay." Over the next 2 weeks, as winter deepened its grip on the mountains, Claire and Elias fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. He slept in the bed while she maintained her pallet by the fire, though she found herself lying awake listening to him breathe, hyper-aware of his presence in a way that made sleep difficult. During the day, she tended his wounds and he taught her mountain skills, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to set snares for rabbits, how to tell poisonous plants from medicinal ones even when they were dormant and snow-covered. They talked. God, how they talked. About everything and nothing, about the past and the careful possibility of a future. Elias told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about learning to trap from his father, about the war and what it had done to him. Claire told him about Boston society, about feeling suffocated by expectations, about the particular loneliness of grief in a city full of people who wanted her to move on before she was ready. "I wasn't a good husband the first time," Elias admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside. "I was too restless, too hungry for something I couldn't name. Adeline deserved better. She deserved someone who was content with the life they had instead of always chasing some dream of what life could be." "Is that what killed them?" Claire asked gently. "Your restlessness?" "In a way. I pushed us into the mountains before we were ready, before I'd learned what I needed to know. My impatience cost them everything." He stared into the fire, his face shadowed with old guilt. "That's why I'm different now. Why I won't rush you. I learned that some things can't be forced or hurried. They have to grow in their own time, or they die." Claire understood what he was offering: patience, space, time to grieve and heal and decide. It was a gift she hadn't expected, and it made her care for him even more. As his wounds began to heal and his strength returned, Elias started taking on more of the work around the cabin. He cut firewood despite her protests, splitting logs with practiced efficiency. He checked her supplies and made lists of what she'd need. He repaired things she hadn't even noticed were broken: a loose hinge on the shed door, a crack in the stove's firebox, a section of floor that had started to rot near the north wall. "You don't have to do all this," Claire said, watching him work. "I know, but I want to. Besides, keeping busy helps me think." "Think about what?" He looked at her then, his eyes holding that same hunger she'd seen the first night. "About how to convince you that what I'm offering isn't a cage or a burden or another loss waiting to happen. About how to show you that two broken people can make something stronger than either of them alone." The intimacy between them grew slowly, carefully, like ice forming over a lake, a touch that lasted longer than necessary. Eyes meeting across the cabin with understanding that needed no words. The way he'd started calling her simply Claire, dropping the formal Mrs. Monroe. The way she'd stopped reaching for the rifle every time he moved. One morning, Claire woke to find Elias already up and dressed, moving quietly around the cabin despite the early hour. His shoulder was nearly healed now, the stitches ready to come out, and he'd regained most of his range of motion. "Where are you going?" she asked, sitting up. "Back to my cabin. Need to check it, make sure the roof held, gather some things." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Time I got out of your space, let you have your solitude back." The thought of him leaving sent a spike of panic through Claire's chest. "When will you be back?" "Do you want me to come back?" The question hung between them, weighted with everything they'd been dancing around for 2 weeks. Claire could say no. She could reclaim her solitude, her independence, her safe isolation. She could go back to being alone, which was what she'd wanted when she came here. Except it wasn't what she wanted anymore. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I want you to come back. I want—" She took a breath, gathering courage. "I want to try. What you talked about. Partnership. Building something together. I'm not ready for everything, not yet, but I'm ready to try." Elias closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Claire saw relief and joy and something deeper that made her heart stutter. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides and knelt beside her pallet, taking her hands in his. "You're sure? Because once we start this, once I let myself truly hope, I don't know if I can go back to being alone. You need to be certain." "I'm not certain about anything, except that I don't want you to leave. That when I thought you might have died in that storm, I realized I'd already started caring. That being alone isn't the same as being at peace." She met his eyes. "I'm scared, Elias. Terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." He kissed her then, gentle and careful and full of restrained hunger. His lips were warm, his beard soft against her face, and Claire felt something inside her that had been frozen for 3 years begin to thaw. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I'll go to my cabin," he said, his voice rough. "Gather what I need, and then I'll come back and we'll figure this out together. All of it. The winter, the mountains, what comes next." He stood, still holding her hand. 3 days, maybe 4? Will you be all right alone until then? I've been alone for 3 years. I can manage 3 days. But after he left, the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. Claire went about her work, feeding Greta, maintaining the fire, preparing meals she ate without tasting. But her thoughts kept straying north, toward the ridge where Elias was presumably securing his own cabin. She wondered what his place looked like, whether it bore signs of his lost family, whether he felt as restless there as she felt here without him. On the second night, as she lay on her pallet trying to sleep, she heard them, wolves, calling to each other in the darkness. The sound raised every primitive instinct she possessed, and she lay there with the rifle across her chest, listening to predators circle and sing their ancient songs. She thought about firing 3 shots, summoning Elias back, but pride stopped her. She'd told him she could manage 3 days. She would manage 3 days. The wolves moved on eventually, leaving only silence and memory. But Claire didn't sleep much that night, and when morning came gray and cold, she was exhausted and irritable and missing Elias with an intensity that frightened her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she saw smoke rising from the north ridge. Elias's cabin, she realized, sending up a column of gray that meant he was there, preparing, maybe thinking about her the way she'd been thinking about him. The smoke continued all day, and Claire found herself checking it compulsively, as if it were a thread connecting them across the distance. She didn't hear them approach. Didn't hear anything until Greta gave a warning whinny from the shed, and hoofbeats sounded in the clearing. Claire grabbed the Winchester and ran to the window, her heart pounding. 3 riders. Men on horseback, picking their way through the snow toward her cabin. Even from a distance, she could see the glint of badges on their coats. Law. Federal marshals or county sheriffs riding into her valley with authority and purpose. Claire's hands tightened on the rifle as the men dismounted, and the lead rider, a grizzled man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, approached the porch and called out, "Mrs. Monroe, we need to talk to you about a man named Elias Cross." Claire's blood turns to ice water in her veins. She kept the Winchester lowered but visible as she opened the door, stepping onto the porch with her chin raised. The 3 men studied her with the frank assessment of lawmen who'd learned to read people quickly, and she studied them right back. The lead rider touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff William Hackett out of Leadville. These are my deputies, Frank Morrison and James Chen. We're looking for Elias Cross. Word is he's been seen in this area." "What do you want with him?" Claire's voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's between us and Mr. Cross. Do you know where he is?" Every instinct screamed at Claire to lie, to protect Elias, but she also understood that lying to lawmen rarely ended well. "He's not here right now. What's this about, Sheriff?" Hackett exchanged glances with his deputies before returning his attention to Claire. "There's been a killing down in Denver. A man named Victor Brennan shot twice in an alley behind a saloon 3 months back. Witnesses say Elias Cross pulled the trigger." The words hit Claire like physical blows. Murder. Elias was wanted for murder. The man she'd been falling for, the man she'd invited into her cabin and her life, was a killer. "That's impossible," she heard herself say. "Elias wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what, ma'am? Kill a man?" Hackett's expression was sympathetic but implacable. "I understand Cross has been helping you out, being neighborly, but the fact is we have 3 witnesses who saw him shoot Brennan in cold blood. Now, I'm not saying Cross didn't have his reasons. Brennan was a piece of work, no doubt about it. But the law is the law, and we need to bring Cross in to stand trial." Claire's mind raced. 3 witnesses. A killing in Denver. But Elias had been up here for 6 years, hadn't he? That's what he'd told her. Unless he'd gone down to Denver for supplies, unless— When exactly did this killing happen? She asked. September 15th, about 10 weeks ago now. September. Before she'd arrived. Before everything between them had started. Claire felt her world tilting, all the careful trust she'd been building crumbling like snow in an avalanche. "Mrs. Monroe," Hackett said gently, "I can see you care about Cross. But if you're sheltering a wanted man, that makes you an accessory. I don't want to have to arrest you, but I will if you force my hand. Now, where is he?" She could point north toward the ridge where smoke still rose from Elias's cabin. She could lead these men straight to him and let justice or vengeance or whatever this was take its course. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. It would protect her from the consequences of trusting someone she barely knew. But even as the thought formed, Claire knew she wouldn't do it. Not without hearing Elias's side. Not without understanding what had really happened. "He has a cabin up on the North Ridge," she said finally, "but I don't know exactly where. These mountains all look the same to me." It was a thin lie, and Hackett clearly knew it, but he also seemed reluctant to push harder. "Fair enough. We'll search the area. But ma'am, if Cross comes back here, you need to send word to Leadville immediately. Don't try to hide him. Don't try to help him run. Men who kill once can kill again, no matter how charming they seem." The deputies began unpacking supplies, clearly intending to make camp in her clearing. Claire watched them with growing alarm, understanding that they planned to wait Elias out, to use her cabin as bait in their trap. "How long do you plan to stay?" she asked. "As long as it takes," Hackett said. "Morrison here will ride into Leadville tomorrow for more supplies, but we're not leaving without Cross." Claire retreated into her cabin, her thoughts churning. She needed to warn Elias, needed to let him know that Law was waiting for him. But how? The lawmen would be watching her every move. And even if she could get away, would Elias thank her for the warning? Or would he see it as interference, as her not trusting him to handle his own problems? She spent the rest of the afternoon pretending normalcy while her mind worked frantically. The lawmen were professional but thorough, asking casual questions about her relationship with Elias, about how often he visited, about what he'd told her. Claire answered carefully, volunteering nothing, admitting only to the bare facts they could verify themselves. "He helped me repair my roof before the first storm," she said. "He was injured by a mountain lion, and I stitched his wounds. That's the extent of it." "That's all?" Hackett raised an eyebrow. "Word in Leadville is you two have been keeping close company." "Word in Leadville is based on speculation, not fact." "So he's not your husband? Not your intended?" Claire felt her face heat. "We're neighbors. Nothing more." The lie tasted bitter, but she told it anyway, some instinct warning her that admitting to deeper feelings would only make things worse. If Elias was truly a murderer, she needed distance. And if he wasn't, if there was more to the story, then her feelings were her own business. As darkness fell, the deputies built a fire in her clearing and settled in for a cold camp, clearly unwilling to impose on her hospitality beyond watering their horses. Claire stayed inside, watching through her window, her mind racing through increasingly desperate plans. She could fire 3 shots. The signal would bring Elias running, but straight into the lawmen's arms. She could try to slip away after dark, but the deputies would surely notice. She could do nothing, let events unfold as they would, but that felt like betrayal of the worst kind. In the end, she decided on a middle path. As full darkness settled and the deputies began their rotating watch schedule, Claire bundled herself in warm clothes, grabbed a lantern, and announced she was going to check on her horse. "I'll come with you," Chen offered, rising from his position by the fire. "The shed is 20 feet away. I think I can manage without an escort." "Ma'am, we're trying to protect you. If Cross comes back, then you'll see him from here. The shed has 1 door and no windows. I'm not going to help him escape through a solid wall." Her tone carried enough irritation to sound genuine. "I'm checking on my horse. You can watch the shed door the entire time if it makes you feel better." Chen looked to Hackett, who nodded permission. Claire walked to the shed with measured steps, aware of eyes on her back. Inside, Greta nickered softly, and Claire spent several minutes genuinely checking the mare over, speaking to her in low tones. But she also looked for something, anything, she could use to get a message out. The shed had the usual collection of tools and tack, but nothing that would help. Then her eyes fell on Greta herself, and an idea formed. Risky, probably foolish, but better than nothing. Claire pulled out a piece of paper she'd tucked into her coat pocket and a stub of pencil. By lantern light, she scrawled a quick message. "Law waiting. 3 men. Warrant for Denver killing. Don't come back. See." She folded the paper small and tight, then braided it into Greta's mane at the very top of her neck where it would be hidden unless someone looked closely. The mare stood patiently through the process, and when Claire was done, she whispered, "If I can get you out tomorrow, you run north. You hear me? North toward the ridge." It was a desperate plan that relied on too many unknowns. Would Greta actually run in that direction? Would Elias find her if she did? Would he even understand the message? But it was something, and something was better than nothing. Claire returned to the cabin to find Hackett waiting on her porch. "Everything all right with your horse?" he asked. "Fine. She gets nervous when there are strangers around." "Smart animal." Hackett studied her face in the lamplight. "Mrs. Monroe, I need to ask you something directly. Do you know what Elias Cross did in Denver?" "You already told me. He shot a man named Victor Brennan." "I told you what happened. I didn't tell you why." Hackett leaned against the porch rail. "Brennan was a pimp and a brute. He specialized in young women, immigrants mostly, girls who had no protection and nowhere to go. He'd get them addicted to opium, work them in his brothel, beat them if they didn't earn enough. 3 girls died working for him that we know of. The law couldn't touch him because he owned judges and cops." Claire felt something shift in her chest. "So Elias shot him twice in an alley after Brennan beat one of his girls so badly she lost an eye. We have witnesses who say Cross warned Brennan to leave the girl alone, told him if he touched her again, there would be consequences. Brennan laughed in his face. 3 days later, Brennan was dead, and Cross disappeared into the mountains." The story hung between them, and Claire understood what Hackett was really telling her, that Elias had killed a man, yes, but that he'd killed a man who deserved killing, who'd brutalized young women with impunity, who the law couldn't or wouldn't stop. "That sounds like self-defense," she said carefully, "or justice." "It sounds like murder, ma'am. I don't care how much of a bastard Brennan was. Cross didn't see him attacking someone. He didn't act in the heat of the moment. He hunted Brennan down and executed him in cold blood. That's premeditated murder under the law, and he'll hang for it if the jury convicts." "And what do you think, Sheriff? Do you think he should hang?" Hackett was quiet for a long moment. "I think the world is probably better off without Victor Brennan in it. I also think we can't have men taking the law into their own hands, no matter how righteous their cause. We start making exceptions. We lose everything that separates us from animals." He met her eyes. "But I also think Cross deserves a fair trial, a chance to tell his story. That's why I'm here instead of a bounty hunter. I want to bring him in alive, let a jury decide his fate." Claire nodded slowly, processing this. Elias was a killer, but not a monster. He'd done what the law wouldn't, what someone needed to do, and now the law wanted to hang him for it. "If he comes back here," Hackett continued, "you need to step aside. Don't get between him and justice. I'd hate to see you hurt because you trusted the wrong man." "I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff." She went inside and barred the door, then sat at her table in the darkness, staring at nothing. Outside, she could hear the deputies talking in low voices by their fire. Beyond that, the night sounds of the mountains, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the ever-present whisper of the creek beneath its ice. Elias had killed a man. The fact sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. But he'd killed a man who'd hurt women, who'd dealt in suffering and death. He'd done what needed doing when no one else would. Did that make him a hero or a murderer? Claire didn't know. She only knew that when she thought about him hanging, about his body swaying from a rope while crowds cheered, her entire being revolted against the image. She couldn't let that happen, wouldn't let it happen, but she also couldn't help him run, couldn't become a fugitive herself, couldn't throw away everything for a man she'd known less than a month. Claire buried her face in her hands, torn between loyalty and law, between the heart that was only just beginning to hope again, and the practical part of her mind that screamed warnings about the cost of caring too much. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the sound of a horse screaming. Claire bolted upright, grabbing the Winchester as she ran to the window. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could see chaos in the clearing. The deputies' horses had broken free from their picket line and were scattering, spooked by something in the woods. "Cat!" Morrison shouted, pointing toward the tree line where a massive mountain lion crouched, its eyes reflecting the firelight like coins. "Mountain cat!" The deputies scrambled for their rifles as the cat snarled, a sound that raised every hair on Claire's body. Then, with a contemptuous flick of its tail, the predator melted back into the forest, leaving only tracks and scattered horses. In the confusion, Claire saw her chance. She ran to the shed, threw open the door, and slapped Greta hard on the rump. "North! Go north!" The mare bolted from the shed, joining the other horses in their panicked flight. Claire watched her disappear into the pre-dawn gray, heading, she hoped, in the direction of Elias's cabin. "Mrs. Monroe!" Hackett appeared beside her, breathing hard. "You all right?" "Fine. The cat didn't come near the shed, but my horse ran off with yours." "Damn it!" Hackett looked at the chaos of the clearing, at his deputies trying to calm their mounts and assess the situation. "Morrison, Chen, you two go after the horses. Can't have them running loose in this country. I'll stay here with Mrs. Monroe." The deputies mounted the two horses they'd managed to catch and rode off in different directions, following the scattered hoof prints. Claire watched them go, praying that Greta had actually run north, that Elias would find her, that the message would reach him before the law did. "You seem mighty calm for someone who just saw a mountain lion," Hackett observed, watching her face. "I've seen one before. Elias shot it before it could attack." "Cross saved your life, then?" "He did. That's why you're protecting him." "I understand, Mrs. Monroe. Gratitude is natural, but gratitude isn't worth becoming a criminal yourself." Claire met his eyes steadily. "I'm not protecting anyone, Sheriff. I told you everything I know. If my horse happened to run in the direction of his cabin, that's not my fault." Hackett's expression told her he knew exactly what she'd done, but proving it was another matter. "The message in the horse's mane, what did it say?" Claire's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." "I saw you go into the shed last night. I saw you spend too long with that horse for someone just checking on its welfare. And I've been tracking men for 20 years, ma'am. I know when someone's trying to get a message out." He stepped closer, his voice low. "What did you tell him?" For a long moment, Claire considered lying, but Hackett was too smart, too experienced. He'd see through any deception. So instead, she told him the truth. "I warned him you were here, that there was a warrant, that he shouldn't come back. You just admitted to obstruction of justice." "Arrest me, then." Hackett studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. "I'm not going to arrest you. Not yet, anyway. But Mrs. Monroe, you need to understand something. By warning Cross, you've made this harder for everyone. He'll run now, probably deeper into the mountains where we can't follow until spring. That means more months of living like a fugitive, more time for desperation to turn a basically good man into something worse. You think you helped him, but you might have just sealed his fate." The words hit hard because Claire feared they might be true, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I gave him a choice. That's more than you were willing to do." "Fair enough." Hackett turned toward the clearing where dawn was beginning to break over the eastern peaks. "We'll wait until my deputies get back with the horses. Then we'll search that north ridge. If we find Cross, we're bringing him in. If we find he's already run—" He glanced back at her. "Then I guess we'll see you again in the spring." The next few hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Morrison returned first, leading two of the scattered horses, but not Greta. Chen came back an hour later with another two, reporting that the remaining horses had scattered too far to track easily in the snow. "Including Mrs. Monroe's mare?" Hackett asked. "Including that one, yeah. Tracks headed north and up toward the high country. I followed them about a mile before they disappeared in some rocky terrain." Hackett nodded, unsurprised. "All right, we'll search the ridge, see if we can find Cross's cabin. Morrison, you ride back to Leadville and bring back more supplies and men." This just became a longer operation. They rode out an hour later, leaving Claire alone in her clearing with strict instructions not to go anywhere. She watched them disappear into the forest, then collapsed onto her porch steps, exhausted and terrified. Had Elias found Greta? Had he understood the message? Was he even now packing his things and running deeper into the mountains? Or was he already in custody, being dragged toward a trial and gallows? Claire spent the day in agony, unable to focus on anything, jumping at every sound. When darkness fell and the lawmen still hadn't returned, she knew they must have found something, either Elias's cabin or signs of his recent presence. The question was whether they'd found Elias himself. She was preparing for another sleepless night when she heard it, the quiet creak of a floorboard on the porch. Claire grabbed the Winchester and spun toward the door, her heart hammering. "It's me." Elias's voice came soft through the wood. "Don't shoot." Claire threw open the door to find him standing there, looking like something out of a nightmare. He was covered in snow and ice, his face haggard with exhaustion, and there was something in his eyes that made her chest ache, a desperate, wild look that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. "They're looking for you," she said, pulling him inside quickly. "They found your cabin, didn't they?" "Found it and searched it. Took anything that looked like evidence, my rifle, my traps, journals my wife kept." He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "I watched them from the rocks above. Would have let them take me, but then I saw Greta. Found her about a mile from my place, still had your message braided in her mane." "Elias, they know. About Denver, about Brennan. I know what they know." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "Claire, I need to tell you what happened. Not the story you probably heard from Hackett, but the truth." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." His voice was raw with urgency. "Because if I run now, if I disappear into these mountains, you need to know who you're protecting and why." So Claire made coffee with trembling hands, and they sat at her table in the lamplight, and Elias told her everything. He'd gone to Denver in September to sell his season's furs and buy supplies for winter. While there, he'd stayed at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, the same Chen whose son was now riding with Hackett, he realized with bitter irony. Mrs. Chen's daughter, a girl of 19 named May, worked at one of Brennan's establishments, trapped there by debt and addiction and fear. "I saw her one night," Elias said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Saw what she'd become, what that monster had done to her. She looked like my Emma would have looked if she'd lived, if the world had gotten its teeth into her, and I couldn't—" He stopped, jaw working. "I went to Brennan, tried to buy out May's debt, tried to reason with him. He laughed in my face, told me the girl was his property, and I should mind my own business if I knew what was good for me. The next day, May had shown up at Mrs. Chen's house with her face beaten purple, her eye swollen shut from a blow that would eventually cost her the eye itself. She'd tried to run, and Brennan had made an example of her. I went back that night," Elias continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. "Found Brennan in an alley behind his saloon, counting his money and laughing with one of his thugs. I gave him a choice, leave Denver and never touch another girl, or face the consequences. He pulled a gun. I was faster." "Self-defense, then," Claire said. "You can argue—" "I shot him twice more after he was already down. Made sure he was dead. Made sure that monster could never hurt anyone again." Elias looked at her directly. "That's murder, Claire. Clean and simple. I don't regret it. I'd do it again. But I won't lie about what it was." Claire absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man sitting at her table with the image of someone executing a wounded enemy. "What happened to May?" "Mrs. Chen got her out of the city, sent her to family in California. She's safe now, free." He paused. "That's what I bought with Brennan's life. One girl's freedom. Maybe not worth hanging for, but worth something." "It's worth everything," Claire said fiercely. "The law failed her. Society failed her. You did what needed doing." "That's what I told myself when I ran. But Claire, here's the thing. If I keep running, I'm spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. And if they catch me, which they eventually will, the judge won't care about May or justice or any of it. They'll see a man who took the law into his own hands, and they'll hang me for it." "So what are you saying?" Elias reached across the table and took her hands. "I'm saying I'm tired of running. I'm saying I want to face this, fight it, tell my story in court, and let a jury decide. Maybe I'll hang anyway. Probably will. But at least I'll die having stood for something instead of hiding in the mountains like the coward I've been for 6 years." "You're not a coward," Claire said, gripping his hands tightly. "You survived. You helped me survive. That takes courage too." "Does it? Or does it take courage to face consequences, to stand up and say, yes, I did this thing, and here's why?" "No." He searched her face. "I need to know something, Claire. If I turn myself in, if I go through with this trial, will you stand with me? Will you testify about the kind of man I am, not the man they'll try to paint me as?" The question hung between them, enormous in its implications. If she said yes, she'd be tying herself to him publicly, admitting to feelings she'd barely acknowledged privately. She'd be painting a target on her own back, potentially making herself complicit in his crime. She'd be risking everything for a man she'd known less than a month. But she'd also be doing what was right, what was just, what her heart demanded even if her head screamed warnings. Yes, she said. I'll stand with you. I'll testify. I'll fight for you. Elias closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. I don't deserve you. That's not for you to decide. Claire squeezed his hands. When do you want to turn yourself in? Now, before I lose my nerve, before Hackett comes back here and arrests me at gunpoint in your cabin. He stood, still holding her hands. Come with me, please. I need to know you're there. So they walked out into the winter darkness together, following the tracks the lawmen had left in the snow. They walked for over an hour through country that was treacherous and beautiful by moonlight, until they saw the distant glow of a campfire where Hackett and his deputies had made camp for the night. You sure about this? Claire whispered as they approached. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Elias squeezed her hand once, then released it and stepped forward into the firelight, his hands raised and empty. Sheriff Hackett, he called out, Elias Cross, I'm surrendering myself to your custody. I'm unarmed and ready to come peacefully. The deputies scrambled to their feet, guns drawn, but Hackett just stood slowly, studying Elias with an unreadable expression. That's a wise choice, Mr. Cross, he said finally. Very wise. Deputies, put those guns away. The man said he's surrendering peacefully. He turned to Claire, noting her presence. Mrs. Monroe, I assume you're here as witness? I'm here as whatever Elias needs me to be, she said firmly. Hackett nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. All right then. Cross, you're under arrest for the murder of Victor Brennan in Denver on September 15th of this year. You have the right to a trial before a jury of your peers. Do you understand these charges? I do. Do you wish to make a statement? Yes. Elias's voice carried clearly in the cold air. I killed Victor Brennan because he was a predator who brutalized young women and the law wouldn't stop him. I gave him a chance to walk away and he pulled a gun instead. I shot him in self-defense and then shot him twice more to make sure he'd never hurt anyone again. I don't regret it. I'd do it again tomorrow. The honesty of it hung in the air like smoke, and Claire saw something shift in Hackett's expression. Respect, maybe, or at least understanding. Well, the sheriff said finally, at least you're honest. That'll count for something with the judge, maybe. He gestured to Chen. Get the chains. As the deputy moved to shackle Elias, Claire stepped forward. Can I have a moment with him, please? Hackett hesitated, then nodded. 1 minute. Don't try anything foolish. Claire moved close to Elias, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold. Thank you, she whispered, for trusting me, for choosing to fight instead of run. Thank you for giving me a reason to want to live, he murmured back. Whatever happens now, whatever they do to me, I won't regret these weeks with you. I won't regret loving you, even if I never got the chance to say it properly. You're saying it now. I am. He bent his head and kissed her, gentle and desperate and full of everything they might never have the chance to become. When they broke apart, his eyes held hers with fierce intensity. Wait for me. However long the trial takes. Whatever the verdict. Wait for me. I will, she promised, even though her heart was breaking. I'll wait. Then Chen was there with the chains, locking iron cuffs around Elias's wrists, and the moment was over. Claire watched them lead him to a horse, watched them secure him in the saddle, watched the small party prepare to ride out, even though dawn was still hours away. Mrs. Monroe, Hackett said, approaching her, you'll need to come to Leadville when the trial starts. The defense will want your testimony. When will that be? Month, maybe 6 weeks. Depends on when the circuit judge makes his rounds. He paused. For what it's worth, I believe Cross when he says Brennan pulled a gun first. That might be enough for self-defense. But those extra shots? He shook his head. Those are going to be hard to explain away. He'll explain them, Claire said with more confidence than she felt. And the jury will understand. Maybe, or maybe they'll see a man who thought he was above the law and decided to teach him otherwise. Hackett mounted his horse. Either way, it'll be interesting. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Monroe, and don't do anything foolish while we're gone. They rode off into the darkness, taking Elias with them, and Claire stood alone in the snow watching until even the sound of hoofbeats had faded into silence. Then she walked back to her cabin, the journey seeming 3 times as long without Elias beside her, and sat at her table until dawn broke over the mountains. She'd lost him again, just as she'd finally found him. Lost him to law and justice and the consequences of doing what was right in a world that didn't always reward righteousness. But she'd also made him a promise. She would wait. She would fight. She would testify to the man he was, not the crime he'd committed. And she would hope, desperate, fragile hope, that sometimes, just sometimes, the system worked the way it was supposed to. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, caring nothing for human law or human love. But inside Claire's chest, something had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer a woman hiding from life in a mountain cabin. She was a woman preparing to fight for the future she wanted, whatever the cost. And that, she thought, as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, was its own kind of courage. The weeks that followed Elias's arrest were the longest of Claire's life. She threw herself into work with desperate energy, cutting firewood until her hands blistered, checking trap lines Elias had shown her, forcing herself to learn the mountain skills she'd need to survive alone if the worst happened. Because the worst could happen. She knew that. The jury could convict. The judge could sentence him to hang. And all her waiting, all her hoping, would end with Elias's body swinging from a rope while she watched helplessly from the crowd. She refused to let herself think that way for long. Instead, she focused on what she could control. She wrote letters to lawyers in Leadville and Denver, to newspapers, to anyone who might care about the truth of what had happened. She tracked down Mrs. Chen through a contact at the Mercantile, and the woman sent her a letter detailing May's suffering under Brennan and her miraculous recovery after his death. She gathered character witnesses, people who'd known Elias before tragedy had driven him into the mountains, people who could testify to his fundamental decency. Dutch Carlson rode up one afternoon in late December, his wagon loaded with supplies she'd requested by letter. The big freighter helped her unload, then sat at her table drinking coffee while she explained everything that had happened. "I knew about Denver," Dutch admitted. "Elias told me about it last spring, when he was drunk and the guilt was eating him alive. Made me promise not to tell anyone, especially not Margaret, when she was still alive." He shook his head. Should have known it would catch up to him eventually. The past always does. "Will you testify?" Claire asked. "About his character? About the kind of man he is?" "I will. Though I don't know if my word carries much weight. I'm just a freighter." Dutch studied her face with shrewd eyes. "You love him, don't you?" Claire didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." Even knowing what he did? Especially knowing what he did. He saw evil and he stopped it when no one else would. That takes a kind of courage most men don't have. "Or a kind of arrogance," Dutch said quietly, "thinking you're the one who gets to decide who lives and who dies." "Maybe, but I'd rather have a man who acts when action is needed than one who hides behind the law's failures." Claire met his eyes steadily. "Will you help me or not?" "I'll help. Already told Hackett I'd testify for the defense when the time comes." He stood, preparing to leave. "But Claire, you need to prepare yourself. Even with all the character witnesses in the world, the fact is Elias killed a man who was already down. That's going to be hard for any jury to overlook." After Dutch left, Claire sat alone with his words echoing in her mind. He was right, of course. Elias had gone beyond self-defense when he'd fired those final 2 shots. He'd crossed a line that law and society couldn't ignore, no matter how righteous his cause. But she couldn't accept that justice meant hanging a good man for killing a monster. There had to be another way. There had to be. The summons came in mid-January, delivered by a young deputy who looked half frozen from the ride up. The trial would begin February 1st in Leadville. Claire was required to appear as a defense witness. She had 3 weeks to prepare. She spent those weeks in a fever of activity, organizing her thoughts and evidence, practicing her testimony in the empty cabin, imagining every question a prosecutor might ask, and preparing her answers. She also spent time at the shed Elias had helped repair, finding pieces of him in every corner, tools he'd organized, spare shingles he'd stacked, a coat he'd left hanging that still smelled of pine smoke and mountain air. One night, unable to sleep, she pulled out the journals she'd been keeping and read back through the entries from her first days in the valley. The woman who'd written those words seemed like a stranger now, so determined to be alone, so convinced that isolation was the same as independence. She'd learned so much since then. About survival, yes, but also about the peculiar strength that comes from letting someone help carry your burdens. About how two broken people could shore each other up in ways that made them both stronger. She wrote a new entry, addressed to a future she hoped would exist. If we survive this trial, if we get the chance to build the life we've talked about, I want to remember this moment, the fear and the hope existing side by side. The way waiting for him feels like holding my breath underwater, not sure if I'll surface before my lungs give out. I want to remember so I never take for granted what we're fighting for. A life. A partnership. Sons, maybe, someday, if we're blessed. But mostly just the chance to wake up beside someone who understands that surviving and living are not the same thing, and who chose to live despite everything the world had taken from him. On the morning of January 30th, Claire loaded her few good clothes into a bag, said goodbye to Greta, and rode down to Leadville with Dutch Carlson, who'd offered to escort her. The journey took 2 days through snow that was still deep but beginning to show signs of the coming thaw. They stayed overnight at a way station, and Claire barely slept, her mind racing with everything that could go wrong. Leadville had grown since her brief stop there in October. The streets were busier, the buildings more numerous, the air thick with the smell of ore processing and human ambition. Dutch took her to a boarding house run by a Mrs. Patterson, a stern-faced woman who nevertheless showed Claire to a clean room and promised hot meals. "The trial starts tomorrow at 9, Dutch said as they stood in the boarding house parlor. "Courthouse is 3 blocks east. You can't miss it. Biggest building in town." "Have you seen Elias? Do you know if he's all right?" Dutch's expression turned grim. "Saw him yesterday. They've got him in the jail behind the courthouse. He's thin, looks like he hasn't been sleeping much, but he's holding up. Asked about you first thing. I told him you were coming, and Claire, the way his face lit up." He shook his head. "That man loves you something fierce." Claire felt tears sting her eyes. "I need to see him, before the trial. Can you arrange it?" "I'll try, but Hackett's running a tight ship. He might not allow visitors." That evening, Claire walked to the courthouse, a 2-story brick building that dominated the main street. The jail was attached at the rear, a squat stone structure with barred windows set high in the walls. She approached the deputy on duty, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave. "I'm here to see Elias Cross," she said. "No visitors. Sheriff's orders. I'm a witness in his trial. I have a right—" "Sheriff's orders," the deputy repeated, but his tone was apologetic. "Sorry, ma'am. Even witnesses got to wait until after the trial starts." Claire wanted to argue, to demand, to force her way past this boy and find Elias in whatever cell they were keeping him in. But she also understood that making a scene would only hurt Elias's case. So she nodded, thanked the deputy, and walked back to the boarding house with her heart aching. That night, she lay awake in her rented room, listening to the sounds of the town, drunken laughter from saloons, the rattle of freight wagons, the distant whistle of a train. She thought about Elias in his cell just blocks away, probably awake too, probably thinking about her. The distance between them felt insurmountable, and yet she knew it was nothing compared to the distance that would separate them if the trial went wrong. Morning came cold and clear. Claire dressed in her best outfit, a dark blue dress she'd brought from Boston, her mother's cameo at her throat, her hair pinned up in the severe style that made her look older and more respectable. She needed the jury to see her as credible, reliable, not as some lovesick woman defending her man against all reason. The courtroom was packed when she arrived. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, craning for a view. News of the trial had spread, apparently, drawing spectators from throughout the territory. Claire found a seat near the front, courtesy of Dutch, who'd arrived early to save her a place. "Big turnout," he murmured. "Folks love a good drama." "This isn't drama. This is Elias's life." "I know, but to them," he gestured at the crowd, "to them it's entertainment." The bailiff called for order, and everyone rose as Judge Marcus Thornton entered. He was a man in his 60s with white hair and a face that had seen too much human folly to be surprised by any of it. He took his seat behind the bench, surveyed the packed courtroom with weary eyes, and nodded to the bailiff. "Bring in the prisoner." The side door opened, and Elias entered in chains. Claire's breath caught at the sight of him. Dutch had been right. He was thinner, his face haggard with sleepless nights and worry. But when his eyes found hers in the crowd, something in his expression shifted. He stood straighter, his jaw set with determination, and Claire understood that her presence gave him strength the same way his had given her strength in those first desperate weeks in the mountains. The prosecutor was a man named William Gaines, polished and professional in a way that immediately set Claire's teeth on edge. He laid out the case with brutal efficiency. Elias had killed Victor Brennan in cold blood, shooting him multiple times in an alley. 3 witnesses had seen the shooting. The defense of protecting a young woman didn't justify murder, especially murder committed after the immediate threat had passed. This is not a case about whether Victor Brennan was a good man, Gaines told the jury. By all accounts, he was not. But we cannot allow vigilante justice in a civilized society. If we permit Elias Cross to execute a man in an alley because he disapproved of that man's business practices, then we open the door to chaos. Every man becomes judge, jury, and executioner. The law loses all meaning. That is what's at stake here, gentlemen. Not one man's life, but the very foundation of order and justice. The defense attorney was a rumpled man named Jacob Walsh, who'd taken Elias's case pro bono after hearing the full story. He was older than Gaines, less polished, but there was a fire in his eyes that gave Claire hope. The prosecution would have you believe this case is simple, Walsh said, addressing the jury. That Elias Cross is nothing more than a vigilante who took the law into his own hands. But the truth is far more complex. Yes, Mr. Cross killed Victor Brennan. He doesn't deny it. But he did so in defense of a young woman who had been brutalized by a monster the law refused to stop. He did so after Brennan pulled a weapon and threatened his life. And yes, he fired additional shots to ensure Brennan could never hurt anyone again. Was that legal? Perhaps not. Was it just? That's for you to decide. The first day of testimony was brutal. The prosecution paraded witnesses who described the shooting in graphic detail, how Elias had confronted Brennan, how words had been exchanged, how Brennan had reached for his gun but Elias had been faster. And then critically, how Elias had stood over Brennan's fallen body and fired twice more into his chest. He was already down, one witness testified, already dying probably. But Cross shot him anyway, like he wanted to make sure. Claire watched the jury's faces and saw doubt, concern, the kind of moral certainty that didn't bode well for Elias. They were men of the territory, used to rough justice, but even they seemed troubled by the image of a man executing a wounded enemy. The second day brought character witnesses for the prosecution, men who'd done business with Brennan, who painted him as a legitimate businessman, unfairly targeted by a mountain man with a grudge. Claire wanted to scream at the lies, but Walsh had cautioned her to remain calm, to trust the process. It wasn't until the third day that the defense began presenting its case. Walsh called Mrs. Chen first, and the older woman's testimony was devastating in its quiet dignity. She described May's suffering in painful detail: the beatings, the forced drug use, the systematic destruction of a young woman's spirit. She described going to the police, to city officials, to anyone who might help, and being turned away every time because Brennan had money and influence. "My daughter was dying," Mrs. Chen said, her voice breaking. "Not quickly, but slowly, piece by piece. And no one would help. No one except Mr. Cross." Gaines tried to discredit her on cross-examination, suggesting she was biased, that she'd exaggerated her daughter's suffering. But Mrs. Chen stood firm, and even Gaines seemed uncomfortable attacking a grieving mother. The fourth day brought more defense witnesses, people who'd known Elias before the mountains, who testified to his character and decency. Dutch Carlson spoke about Elias's reliability, his honesty, the way he'd helped Margaret Monroe survive in the high country. A former Army sergeant talked about Elias's bravery during the war, the medals he'd earned, the lives he'd saved. And then Walsh called Claire to the stand. She walked to the witness box on legs that felt like water, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom watching her. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Walsh approached with a gentle smile. "Please state your name for the record." "Claire Monroe." "And how do you know the defendant, Elias Cross?" "He's my neighbor in the high country. My cabin is about 3 miles from his." "When did you first meet Mr. Cross?" Claire took a breath and began telling the story. She described that first night, Elias's unexpected appearance on her porch, the way he'd helped her prepare for winter. She talked about his knowledge of the mountains, his patience in teaching her survival skills, the way he'd risked his life to reach her cabin after she'd fired the distress signal. "He saved my life," she said simply, "multiple times, and he asked nothing in return except the chance to help someone who needed help." Walsh guided her through more questions, establishing Elias's character and actions. Then he asked the critical question, "Mrs. Monroe, knowing what you know about the events in Denver, do you believe Elias Cross is a danger to society?" Claire looked directly at the jury. "No, I believe he's a man who saw an injustice the law wouldn't address, and took action when no one else would. I believe he's a man of profound moral courage who put himself at risk to protect someone helpless. Is that a danger to society, or is it exactly the kind of courage we should be celebrating?" She saw several jury members nod slightly, and hope flared in her chest. But then Gaines rose for cross-examination, and his pleasant demeanor disappeared. "Mrs. Monroe, isn't it true that you and the defendant have developed a romantic relationship?" Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We've become close, yes." "How close? Are you lovers?" Walsh objected, arguing relevance, but the judge allowed the question. Claire met Gaines's eyes steadily. "We care for each other deeply, but our relationship is not the issue here. Isn't it? You're testifying on behalf of a man you love. How can the jury trust your testimony to be objective?" "Because I'm telling the truth. My feelings for Elias don't change the facts of what happened or who he is." Gaines paced before the jury box. "Let me ask you this, Mrs. Monroe. If Mr. Cross were to be acquitted, would you marry him?" Claire hesitated, caught off guard. "It's a simple question. Would you marry a man who executed someone in an alley?" "I would marry a man who had the courage to act when action was needed," Claire said, her voice rising. "I would marry a man who values justice over law when the law fails. And yes, if Elias is acquitted, if he's free, then I would be honored to be his wife." The declaration hung in the air, and Claire saw Elias's face transform with emotion, but Gaines wasn't finished. "So you admit that your testimony is biased, that you'll say anything to free the man you love, regardless of whether it's true?" "No. I'm saying that my love for Elias makes me uniquely qualified to testify about his character. I've seen him at his most vulnerable. I've seen him struggle with guilt over what happened in Denver. I've seen him choose to surrender rather than run, to face justice rather than hide. Those aren't the actions of a cold-blooded killer. Those are the actions of a good man who made a hard choice in an impossible situation." Gaines tried several more questions, but Claire held firm, and eventually the judge dismissed her from the stand. She returned to her seat beside Dutch, her heart pounding, unsure whether she'd helped or hurt Elias's case. The final witness was Elias himself. Walsh had debated putting him on the stand. Defendants rarely testified, and it was risky, but Elias had insisted. The jury needed to hear from him directly, needed to understand not just what he'd done, but why. Elias took the stand with quiet dignity, his chains removed for the testimony. Walsh led him through the events of September, and Elias answered each question with unflinching honesty. "I went to that alley intending to convince Brennan to leave May alone," he said. "I offered him money. I offered to help him leave Denver and start over somewhere else. I tried everything I could think of to resolve the situation peacefully. And when he pulled his weapon, I defended myself. I shot him center mass, a killing shot. He went down immediately. And then you fired twice more." "Yes." "Why?" Elias looked at the jury, his expression open and raw. "Because I wanted to make sure. Because I'd seen what happened to May, to the other girls. Because I knew that if Brennan survived, he'd just go back to hurting people, and the law wouldn't stop him. So I made a choice. I became judge and executioner, just like the prosecutor said. And I don't regret it." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and the judge banged his gavel for order. Walsh looked pained, clearly wishing Elias had been less honest. But Elias continued, "I know what I did was wrong in the eyes of the law. I know I crossed a line. But gentlemen, I'm asking you to consider the larger picture. The law is supposed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. But when the law fails, when it protects monsters instead of victims, then what are decent people supposed to do? Just watch? Just let evil thrive because stopping it would be illegal? He leaned forward. I couldn't do that. I couldn't walk away knowing Brennan would keep hurting people. Maybe that makes me a criminal, but it also made me the only one willing to do what was necessary. Gaines's cross-examination was merciless. He hammered at the illegality of Elias's actions, at his decision to take the law into his own hands, at the dangerous precedent it would set to acquit him. Mr. Cross, do you believe you're above the law? No, sir. Then why did you act outside it? Because sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes justice requires more than legal proceedings and court dates. It requires action. Action. That's an interesting way to describe murder. It was murder, Elias agreed calmly, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But I won't apologize for it. Not to you, not to this court, not to anyone. The final arguments took place on the 5th day. Gaines was eloquent, painting Elias as a dangerous vigilante who couldn't be allowed to go free. Walsh countered with passion, arguing that Elias had done what any moral person would do when faced with evil the law wouldn't stop. The question before you, Walsh told the jury, is not whether Elias Cross killed Victor Brennan. He did. The question is whether justice was served by that killing, or whether we should add another body to Brennan's victim list by hanging a good man for doing what was right. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 endless days during which Claire paced her boarding house room, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything except the 12 men deciding Elias's fate. Dutch stayed with her as much as propriety allowed, providing silent companionship and coffee that grew cold in her hands. On the evening of the 2nd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, the crowd even larger than before, everyone sensing they were about to witness history one way or another. Elias was brought in, and once again his eyes found Claire's. She tried to communicate everything she felt in that look, love and faith and desperate hope. He nodded slightly, accepting whatever was about to happen. The jury foreman stood, a weathered rancher named Thomas Blake, who'd served in the war and lost a son to violence. Judge Thornton addressed him formally. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. In the matter of the Territory versus Elias Cross on the charge of murder in the 1st degree, how do you find? Blake looked at Elias, and for a moment Claire thought she saw something like understanding in his eyes. We find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Some people cheered, others shouted in anger, and the judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Claire felt tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with relief and disbelief. Not guilty. Elias was free. But the judge wasn't finished. He waited until the crowd had quieted, then fixed Elias with a stern look. Mr. Cross, while the jury has acquitted you of murder, I want to be clear about something. What you did was not justice. It was vengeance. The fact that Victor Brennan was a reprehensible human being doesn't give you the right to execute him. The jury has apparently decided that your actions fall within the bounds of self-defense and justifiable homicide, and I'm bound by their verdict. But if you ever come before this court again for similar actions, I will not be so lenient. Do you understand? Elias stood. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. Then you're free to go. Thornton banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. The deputies removed Elias's chains, and he stood there for a moment, seeming not quite able to believe what had happened. Then he was moving through the crowd, pushing past people trying to congratulate or condemn him, his eyes locked on Claire. She met him halfway, and they collided in an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Elias lifted her off her feet, burying his face in her hair, and Claire held him with all her strength, both of them crying without shame. It's over, she whispered. You're free. We're free. Not yet, he murmured into her hair. Not quite yet. He set her down and dropped to one knee, right there in the courthouse, in front of everyone, still holding her hands. Claire Monroe, I have nothing to offer you but a cabin in the mountains and a life that will never be easy. But I'm offering you everything I am, everything I have. Marry me. Build a life with me. Give me the chance to be the man you deserve. Claire looked down at him through her tears, at this man who'd been broken and had found the courage to heal, who'd faced death rather than run from his choices, who'd stood in a courtroom and admitted his sins because honesty mattered more than freedom. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just yes." He stood and kissed her, and the remaining crowd applauded or jeered depending on their opinion of the verdict. But Claire didn't care. All that mattered was Elias, solid and real and free in her arms. They married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the church, with Dutch Carlson and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. Claire wore the blue dress from the trial, and Elias wore new clothes Dutch had helped him buy, rough but clean, befitting a mountain man starting a new chapter. The preacher kept the service short, perhaps uncomfortable with marrying a man so recently accused of murder, but he pronounced them husband and wife with genuine warmth. That night, in a room Dutch had rented for them, Claire and Elias finally had the privacy they'd never had before. They made love with gentle urgency, learning each other's bodies, healing each other's wounds, creating something new from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Afterward, lying in the darkness with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, Claire felt peace settle over her for the first time in years. "I want to leave Colorado," Elias said quietly. "Start fresh somewhere the past doesn't follow us." "Where would we go?" "Oregon, maybe. I hear the Willamette Valley is good land, still available for homesteading. We could build something there. A real home, not just a cabin to hide in." "And sons?" Claire asked, remembering his words from that first night. "You still want sons?" "I want a family, children, if we're blessed with them. But mostly I just want a life with you. Everything else is extra." Claire smiled in the darkness. "Then let's go to Oregon. Let's build something new." They stayed in Leadville another week, selling what few possessions they had and preparing for the journey west. Mrs. Chen gave them supplies and her blessing, telling Claire that May was thriving in California, that she'd gotten married and was expecting a child of her own. "You tell Mr. Cross that my daughter's happiness is because of him," she said, pressing a package of food into Claire's hands. "Tell him that sometimes breaking the law is the most moral thing a person can do." Dutch gave them a wagon and a team of horses as a wedding present, refusing payment despite their protests. "You two gave me something I'd lost, faith that there's still good people in this world willing to fight for what's right. That's worth more than any wagon." They left Leadville on a clear March morning, the mountains behind them still snow-capped but showing signs of spring's approach. They rode north first, back to Claire's cabin to collect the few things worth keeping: Margaret's rifle, the journals Claire had written, tools and supplies that would serve them in Oregon. Standing in the cabin one last time, looking at the space where she'd learned to survive and then to live, Claire felt a bittersweet ache. "Ready to say goodbye?" Elias asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I think so. This place taught me what I needed to know, but it's not home anymore." "Where is home?" She turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "Wherever we are together. That's home." They burned the cabin before they left, not from malice, but from practicality. Better to let fire take it than let it rot slowly into the mountain. They stood together watching the flames consume the structure, and Claire thought about all the versions of herself she was leaving behind. The widow, the isolate, the woman too afraid to hope. From the ashes, metaphorically at least, a new Claire was emerging. A woman who'd learned that strength came not from isolation, but from partnership. That justice was more important than law. That love, when you were brave enough to accept it, could heal even the deepest wounds. The journey to Oregon took 3 months. They traveled slowly, stopping to work when they needed money, camping under stars that seemed impossibly bright, making love in their wagon while coyotes sang in the distance. They talked about everything and nothing, planning their future farm, arguing about names for children not yet conceived, learning the 1,000 small intimacies that make a marriage. They reached the Willamette Valley in June, when the land was green and lush and full of promise. They filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of good land with a creek running through it and timber for building, and they began the work of making a life. That first year was hard. They lived in their wagon while building a cabin, working dawn to dusk, clearing land and planting crops. Claire's hands, once soft with Boston privilege, became calloused and strong. Elias's shoulders broadened further with the labor of building their future one log at a time. But they were happy. Deeply, impossibly happy in a way neither had thought possible again. In the spring of their second year, Claire discovered she was pregnant. She told Elias while they were working in their garden, planting seeds for the coming season, and he dropped his hoe and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested. Their son was born in January, during a snow that reminded them both of Colorado mountains, and trials survived. They named him Thomas Samuel Cross, honoring both their pasts while looking toward the future. When Elias held his son for the first time, Claire saw tears stream down his face. For the family he'd lost, yes, but also for the family he'd found. 2 years later came their daughter, Margaret Claire. Then another son, Elias Jr. Their cabin grew into a proper house, their crops prospered, and their land became known throughout the valley as a place of hospitality and hard work. But they never forgot where they'd come from or what they'd survived together. On winter nights, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Elias would tell Claire stories of the mountains, and she would tell him about the woman she'd been when she first arrived, so certain she wanted to be alone, so convinced that isolation was safety. "I'm glad you were wrong," Elias would say, pulling her close. "So am I," she would answer. Years passed. The children grew strong and curious, learning to farm and hunt and read. Thomas, their eldest, had his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce sense of justice. Margaret was all fire and determination, afraid of nothing. And Elias Jr. was the peacemaker, the one who saw the best in everyone. When Thomas was 12, a man came to their farm asking about Elias Cross. Claire's heart seized with old fear. Had someone from Denver come seeking revenge? Had the past finally caught up with them? But the man was Mrs. Chen's son, the deputy who'd helped arrest Elias years before. He'd brought news. May had established a home for women escaping violence in San Francisco, and she wanted Elias to know that his action that night in Denver had inspired her to help others. "She said to tell you that one act of courage can ripple outward forever," Chen said, "that you saved more than just her life that night. You saved everyone she's been able to help since." After Chen left, Elias was quiet for a long time, standing on their porch looking out at the land they'd built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Claire asked, coming to stand beside him. "What happened in Denver?" "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the law failed so badly that violence was the only answer." He took her hand. "But I don't regret the choice itself. And I don't regret anything that came after, the trial, the fear, the risk, because it led me to you, to this." He gestured at their farm, at the house where their children were laughing over dinner preparations. "We built a good life," Claire said. "We built a great life. From broken pieces and desperate choices and the kind of love that only comes from surviving hell together." As the sun set over their Oregon farm, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Claire leaned into her husband and thought about the journey that had brought them here, about a widow who'd fled to the mountains seeking solitude, about a mountain man who'd appeared in the darkness offering an impossible future, about murder and justice and the thin line between them, about a trial that could have ended in death but instead became the beginning of life. Their story could have been a tragedy. By all rights, it should have been. But instead, through courage and love and the willingness to fight for what was right, even when the cost was high, they'd created something beautiful, something lasting. 3 days before Thomas left for college in Portland, he asked his father about the trial, about the killing that had shaped their family's history, even if it was rarely discussed. "Did you do the right thing, Pa?" he asked. Elias considered the question carefully. "I did what I thought was necessary at the time. Whether it was right, that's not for me to decide. But I'll tell you this, son. Sometimes in life, you're faced with a choice between law and justice, between safety and courage, between accepting evil and fighting it, even when the fight might destroy you. When those moments come, and they will come, you have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Not based on what others will think, not based on what's easy, but based on what you can live with when you look at yourself in the mirror. And if the choice costs you everything?" Elias smiled and gestured toward Claire, who was working in her garden with their youngest children. Then you pray that you're lucky enough to find someone who thinks your everything is worth fighting for, too. Years later, when they were old and gray and the farm had been passed to their children, Claire and Elias would sit on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set over land that had become home in ways the mountains never could have. "No regrets?" Claire would ask, as she did sometimes. "None," Elias would answer, as he always did. "You?" "Not a single one." And it was true. Through all the fear and struggle, through trials both legal and personal, through the hard work of building a life from scratch, they'd found something rare and precious, a partnership forged in crisis and tempered by time. They'd learned that the mountains don't care about your reasons for coming, only whether you're strong enough to stay. But more importantly, they'd learned that sometimes strength isn't about enduring alone. Sometimes it's about having the courage to let someone help carry the weight, to build something together from the broken pieces of separate pasts. Their story wasn't the one Claire had imagined when she'd stepped off that train in Leadville with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter promising a cabin in the wilderness. It was better, fuller, richer with meaning and love and the kind of contentment that only comes from surviving the worst and choosing to believe in the possibility of better. On a spring morning in their 70th year, they rode together to the high meadow on their property where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. They spread a blanket and lay together under the vast Oregon sky, and Elias said what he'd said 1,000 times before, but which never lost its power. "Thank you for saving my life." "You saved mine first," Claire answered, as she always did. "Then I guess we're even. More than even. We're blessed." And they were. Against all odds, despite every obstacle, through murder and trial and the long journey from darkness into light, they'd built exactly the life they'd dreamed of that first night in the mountains when Elias had knocked on Claire's door and offered her an impossible future. They'd taken that future, fought for it, earned it, and lived it fully, right up to their final days when they died within hours of each other, the way people who are truly two halves of one whole often do. Their children buried them side by side on the land they'd loved, under a stone that read simply, "Claire and Elias Cross." They built a home, they raised a family, they lived with courage and died with grace. The mountains taught them to survive. Love taught them to thrive. And in the years that followed, their story was told and retold, not as a cautionary tale about vigilante justice or the dangers of taking the law into one's own hands, but as a love story. The story of two broken people who found each other in the wilderness and discovered that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in facing down danger alone, but in choosing to build a future with someone equally scarred, equally stubborn, and equally determined to create something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. It was a story about second chances and hard choices, about justice and mercy, about the thin line between right and wrong, and how love gives you the courage to walk that line without losing yourself. It was their story, and it was complete.